Hello there and welcome to the show. Tonight we're doing something a little different. We're going to be looking at some of history's greatest hits, but not in the fun, catchy tune sort of way. No, tonight we're counting down the top 10 most dangerous dictators in modern history. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Another top 10 list? What's next? Top 10 cutest cat videos that will make you forget about impending global crises. And while that does sound tempting, this is important, because these individuals weren't just bad bosses or mean landlords. They were architects of unimaginable suffering, men who reshaped nations in their own terrifying image. Their influence wasn't confined to their borders, it spilled over, causing global conflicts, humanitarian disasters, and leaving scars that are still visible today. These leaders commanded absolute power, and with that power they orchestrated famine, genocide, and war on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. It's like they all attended the same horrifying summer camp for aspiring tyrants and came back with a shared, blood-soaked arts and crafts project. They turned countries into personal fiefdoms and their people into pawns in their cruel, megalomaniacal games. So buckle up, because this is going to be a grim ride. We're going to delve into the reigns of these 10 figures, not for shock value, but to understand the mechanics of tyranny. We need to look at how they rose to power, how they maintained it, and the devastating legacies they left behind. It's a journey through the darkest chapters of the 20th century, a sobering look at what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of the absolute worst people imaginable. Let's begin, shall we? Kicking off our list at number 10 is a man whose name is as flamboyant as his fashion sense, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Now, Gaddafi seized power in a 1969 coup, and for the next 42 years, he wasn't just the leader of Libya. He called himself the brotherly leader and guide of the revolution, which sounds less like a political title and more like a dangerously over-enthusiastic camp counselor. He ruled with a bizarre and brutal mix of pan-Arabism, socialism, and his own personal brand of political theory laid out in his infamous Green Book, a work so profound it made most self-help books look like Shakespeare. Under Gaddafi, Libya became a pariah state. He wasn't content with just oppressing his own people, which he did with gusto, using his secret police to crush any and all dissent. No, he had international ambitions. He funneled Libya's vast oil wealth into sponsoring terrorism around the globe, from the IRA in Ireland to militant groups in the Philippines. He was the world's chaos agent, the guy who'd show up to a dinner party and set the curtains on fire just to see what would happen. His regime was directly implicated in the 1988 Lockerbie bombing, which killed 270 people, a horrific act of terror that cemented his status as an international outlaw. Life inside Libya was a surreal experience. Gaddafi's personality cult was everywhere. His face adorned everything from billboards to coffee mugs. He surrounded himself with an all-female bodyguard unit, the Amazonian Guard, a move that was equal parts progressive-seeming and deeply, deeply weird. He would deliver rambling, hours-long speeches on television, veering from topic to topic with the coherence of a man arguing with a squirrel. It was a performance of power designed to keep everyone, both at home and abroad, completely and utterly off balance. The economy, despite the oil, was a mess for ordinary Libyans. While Gaddafi and his family lived in obscene luxury, infrastructure crumbled, and opportunities vanished for anyone not connected to the regime. He treated the national treasury like his personal ATM, funding vanity projects and foreign adventures while his people struggled. He was a dictator who managed to be both terrifying and at times bafflingly absurd, a combination that made him uniquely dangerous. He believed he was a philosopher king, a revolutionary icon for the ages. His end came during the Arab Spring in 2011. After months of brutal civil war, where his forces fired on his own people, he was captured and killed by rebel fighters. His final moments, caught on a shaky cell phone video, were a grim and violent end to a grim and violent reign. Gaddafi's legacy is one of a nation rich in resources but hollowed out by decades of erratic, tyrannical rule, a cautionary tale of what happens when one man's ego is allowed to run an entire country. Coming in at number 9 is a man whose brutality was so extreme it almost defied belief. Amin Dada of Uganda. Amin seized power in a military coup in 1971, and for the next 8 years he subjected his country to a reign of terror that was as savage as it was unpredictable. He gave himself a laundry list of titles, including the classic Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, which is, you have to admit, a bold claim for a man who was landlocked. This wasn't just eccentricity, it was the window dressing for a deeply paranoid and violent megalomaniac. Amin's regime was characterized by breathtaking cruelty. It's estimated that up to 300,000 Ugandans were murdered during his rule. His secret police, the State Research Bureau, were infamous for their methods of torture and execution. People disappeared in the middle of the night, their bodies later found floating in the Nile River or dumped in forests. He targeted ethnic groups, intellectuals, journalists, anyone he perceived as a threat. He turned Uganda into a hunting ground, and he was the apex predator. He was known to keep the heads of his enemies in a freezer, a detail so ghoulish it sounds like it belongs in a horror film, not a history lesson. Economically, Amin was a catastrophe. In 1972, he ordered the expulsion of Uganda's entire Asian population, giving them just 90 days to leave the country. These were the people who formed the backbone of the nation's commercial class. He handed their businesses and properties over to his cronies, who promptly ran them into the ground. The economy completely collapsed, shelves went bare, infrastructure decayed, and Uganda, once a promising post-colonial nation, was reduced to a state of near total ruin. It was a masterclass in how to destroy a country in under a decade. His foreign policy was just as erratic and destructive as his domestic policy. He played games with the international community, at one point offering to be the King of Scotland and famously sending a bizarre telegram to Richard Nixon, wishing him a speedy recovery from Watergate. But this buffoonish exterior masked a real threat. His most infamous international act was his support for the hijacking of an Air France plane in 1976, which led to the daring Israeli rescue mission at Entebbe Airport, a major international incident that he had directly facilitated. Amin's rule finally ended in 1979, when neighboring Tanzania, fed up with his provocations, invaded and overthrew his regime. Amin fled into exile, first to Libya and then to Saudi Arabia, where he lived out the rest of his days in comfortable obscurity, never once facing justice for his crimes. He died in 2003, leaving behind a legacy of mass murder, economic collapse, and a nation so traumatized that it took decades to even begin to recover. He was a monster, plain and simple. At number 8, we have a dictator whose reign lasted so long it became a grim feature of the European landscape. Spain's Generalissimo, Franco. Franco is a bit different from some of the others on this list. He wasn't a flamboyant showman or a wild-eyed revolutionary. He was a dour, cautious, and ruthlessly effective authoritarian who came to power through a bloody and devastating civil war. From 1939 until his death in 1975, he held Spain in an iron grip, a fascist hangover that lasted long after the party ended for his friends Hitler and Mussolini. The Spanish Civil War itself was a brutal preview of World War II. Franco's nationalist forces, backed by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, fought a merciless campaign against the democratically elected Republican government. The war cost 500,000 lives and saw horrific atrocities like the bombing of Guernica, immortalized in Picasso's masterpiece. When Franco won, the killing didn't stop. He unleashed what's known as the White Terror, a systematic campaign of repression against his former opponents. Tens of thousands were executed, and hundreds of thousands were imprisoned in concentration camps. For nearly 4 decades, Franco's Spain was a place of suffocating conformity. He imposed a rigid, ultra-conservative Catholic nationalism on the country. Political parties were banned, trade unions were crushed, and a powerful secret police, the Brigada Politico-Social, ensured that any whisper of dissent was silenced. Regional cultures like those of Catalonia and the Basque Country were brutally suppressed. Their languages were forbidden in public, and their traditions were outlawed. Spain became a cultural prison, isolated from the rest of a rapidly modernizing Europe. Unlike his Axis allies, Franco cleverly managed to keep Spain out of World War II, a move that likely saved his regime from being toppled in 1945. For years, Spain was an international pariah. But as the Cold War heated up, Franco's staunch anti-communism made him a useful if unsavory ally for the United States. This strategic alignment gave his regime a veneer of international legitimacy and helped it survive. He was the quiet dictator, the one who outlasted them all through sheer, stubborn cruelty and political cunning. Franco's death in 1975 finally opened the door to democracy. He had arranged for the monarchy to be restored, hoping his hand-picked successor, King Juan Carlos I, would continue his authoritarian legacy. In a twist Franco never would have predicted, the king instead skillfully dismantled the fascist state and ushered in a democratic government. But Franco's legacy is still fiercely debated in Spain today. The pact of forgetting that allowed for a peaceful transition also meant that many of his regime's crimes went unpunished, leaving deep wounds that have yet to fully heal. Number 7. Benito Mussolini, the Sawdust Caesar. Sliding into the number 7 spot is the man who literally wrote the playbook on fascism, Italy's Benito Mussolini. Il Duce, as he styled himself, was the original 20th century strongman, a charismatic bully who pioneered the political aesthetic that so many others would copy. He was all about jutting jaws, theatrical speeches from balconies, and a cult of personality that promised to restore the glory of the Roman Empire. The only problem was, his version of the Roman Empire was built on a foundation of violence, incompetence, and ultimately, national humiliation. Mussolini and his blackshirts came to power in 1922 with their March on Rome, which was less of a conquering army and more of a poorly organized camping trip that the king was too scared to stop. Once in power, he systematically dismantled Italian democracy. He outlawed opposition parties, took control of the press, and created a secret police force to terrorize his opponents. He preached a doctrine of hyper-nationalism, obedience, and war. Believe, obey, fight was the slogan, which is a terrible way to live your life but a fantastic way to run a totalitarian state into the ground. His grand promises of a new Roman Empire were, to put it mildly, a bit of an overreach. His military adventures were often disastrous. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was marked by brutal tactics, including the use of mustard gas against civilians. When he finally entered World War II, he did so thinking it would be a short, victorious ride on Hitler's coattails. Instead, the Italian military proved to be woefully unprepared and poorly led, suffering humiliating defeats in Greece and North Africa. Mussolini was the guy who shows up to a gunfight with a leaky water pistol. The most catastrophic decision of Mussolini's career was his alliance with Adolf Hitler. The Pact of Steel tied Italy's fate to that of Nazi Germany. This led Mussolini to enact his own anti-Semitic racial laws in 1938, stripping Italian Jews of their rights and paving the way for their deportation to Nazi death camps during the German occupation of Italy. It was a craven and despicable act, a desperate attempt to curry favor with his more powerful and infinitely more evil partner in crime. By 1943, with the Allies invading Sicily, Mussolini's own fascist Grand Council had had enough. They voted him out of power, and he was arrested. Though he was briefly broken out of prison by German commandos and installed as the puppet leader of a Nazi-controlled state in northern Italy, his time was up. In April 1945, while trying to flee to Switzerland, he was captured by Italian partisans, executed, and his body was hung upside down in a Milan piazza for public display. It was a brutal end for a man whose blustering ambition brought nothing but war, death, and ruin to his country. Number 6. Kim Jong-il, the dear leader of darkness. At number 6, we enter the bizarre and terrifying world of the Hermit Kingdom with North Korea's dear leader Kim Jong-il. When his father, the great leader Kim Il-sung, died in 1994, Kim Jong-il inherited the world's most isolated and totalitarian state. This wasn't a transfer of power. It was a dynastic succession, like a medieval monarchy, but with nuclear weapons and a much, much worse haircut. For 17 years he ruled over 25 million people with absolute authority, maintaining a system of control so complete it's almost hard to fathom. Life for the average North Korean under Kim Jong-il was a living nightmare. The entire country is effectively a giant prison camp. Any form of dissent is met with imprisonment, torture, or execution. Not just for the individual, but often for 3 generations of their family under the Songbun system. The state controls every aspect of life, where you live, what you learn, what job you do, and what you are allowed to think. The personality cult surrounding him was all-encompassing. State propaganda claimed he had a supernatural birth, that he could control the weather, and that he scored 11 holes in one the first time he ever played golf. It's so absurd you'd laugh if it wasn't the ideological bedrock of a brutal slave state. While his people starved, Kim Jong-il lived a life of unimaginable luxury. He had a taste for the finer things, Hennessy cognac, lobster, and a massive film collection. He famously had a team of chefs who traveled the world to find the most exquisite delicacies for him. This, while his country was going through a devastating famine in the 1990s known as the Arduous March, which killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people. It's a level of callous indifference that is truly breathtaking. He let his people eat grass while he feasted on shark fin soup. His main goal on the international stage was simple: survival of his regime at any cost, and his trump card was nuclear weapons. He pursued a military-first policy, pouring the country's scarce resources into developing a nuclear arsenal and ballistic missiles. This wasn't just for show, it was a blackmail strategy. He would provoke crises, test missiles, and then use the threat of his weapons to extort food, fuel, and other aid from the international community. He turned nuclear brinkmanship into a form of statecraft, keeping the entire region on a knife's edge. Kim Jong-il died of a heart attack in 2011, passing the torch of tyranny to his son, Kim Jong-un, who has continued his father's policies with gusto. The legacy of Kim Jong-il is a nation frozen in time, a starving, brainwashed populace, and a nuclear threat that continues to destabilize the world. He perfected a unique brand of totalitarianism, one that mixes Stalinist brutality with a cult of personality so bizarre it feels like a parody. But the suffering it causes is all too real. Number 5. Saddam Hussein, the Tyrant of Tikrit. Cracking our top 5 is the Butcher of Baghdad himself, Saddam Hussein of Iraq. For over 2 decades, Saddam ruled Iraq with a combination of fear, brutality, and a mustache that could only be described as aggressively authoritarian. He came to power officially in 1979, but he had been the ruthless power behind the scenes for years. His method of consolidating power was televised. He called a meeting of the Ba'ath Party leadership, read out a list of alleged conspirators, and had them arrested and led from the room one by one to be executed, all while he calmly smoked a cigar. It was a chilling message: cross me, and you will be erased. Saddam's rule was defined by paranoia and violence. His secret police, the Mukhabarat, were everywhere, creating a society where people were afraid to speak freely even in their own homes. Torture chambers were a standard tool of statecraft. His regime was particularly brutal towards Iraq's Kurdish population and its Shia majority. He saw them as threats to his Sunni-dominated rule and sought to crush them without mercy. His cruelty was personal. He had members of his own family, including his sons-in-law, executed when he suspected them of disloyalty. His reign was also marked by disastrous and bloody wars. In 1980, he launched an invasion of Iran, hoping for a quick victory. Instead, it turned into a brutal 8-year war of attrition that killed over 1 million people on both sides. It was during this war that Saddam demonstrated his willingness to use weapons of mass destruction. He repeatedly used chemical weapons, including mustard gas and nerve agents, against Iranian soldiers, and most infamously, against his own people. The 1988 Halabja chemical attack killed an estimated 5,000 Kurdish civilians in a single day, a truly monstrous crime against humanity. Just 2 years after the war with Iran ended, he made another catastrophic miscalculation by invading Kuwait in 1990. This led to the First Gulf War, where a US-led coalition swiftly liberated Kuwait and decimated the Iraqi army. The defeat led to uprisings by Kurds in the north and Shias in the south, which Saddam's regime crushed with unimaginable ferocity. For the next decade, Iraq was under crippling international sanctions, which devastated the civilian population, while Saddam and his elite continued to live in palaces, building monuments to himself and funding his security apparatus. Saddam Hussein's rule came to a definitive end in 2003 with the US-led invasion of Iraq. After months on the run, he was found hiding in a hole in the ground near his hometown of Tikrit, a pathetic end for a man who had cultivated such an image of power. He was put on trial by an Iraqi court, convicted of crimes against humanity, and executed by hanging in 2006. His legacy is one of endless conflict, unspeakable brutality in a region that remains deeply unstable, partly as a result of his destructive reign. At number 4, we have a man whose name is really synonymous with genocide: Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. When his forces captured the capital, Phnom Penh, in 1975, they didn't just want to change the government, they wanted to reset civilization itself. They declared Year Zero and set about creating a purely agrarian communist utopia. The result was, well, not a utopia. It was actually one of the most horrific and concentrated acts of mass murder in human history. a 4-year period that saw the death of nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population. Pol Pot's vision was just insane in its radicalism. The Khmer Rouge immediately emptied the cities, forcing millions of people on death marches into the countryside to work as slave laborers on collective farms. They abolished money, private property, religion, and education. They targeted anyone with an education or even signs of it, like wearing glasses or speaking a foreign language. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, and monks were systematically executed. Families were separated, with children being taught to spy on their parents. It was a complete and total war on history, culture, and honestly the human intellect itself. The conditions in the killing fields, as they came to be known, were hell on earth. People were forced to work 12 to 15-hour days on starvation rations. The slightest infraction could result in immediate execution. Since bullets were considered too expensive to waste, people were often bludgeoned to death with farming tools, their bodies dumped into mass graves. The most infamous prison was Tuol Sleng, or S21, a former high school in Phnom Penh, where at least 14,000 people were tortured and killed. Only a handful survived. The meticulous records and photos the Khmer Rouge kept of their victims serve as a chilling testament to their bureaucratic cruelty. The regime's ideology was a toxic brew of extreme Maoism and Khmer nationalism, fueled by a deep-seated paranoia about foreign influence, particularly from neighboring Vietnam. This paranoia was a death sentence for Cambodia's ethnic Vietnamese and Cham Muslim populations, who were targeted for extermination. The Khmer Rouge's radical self-reliance policy meant they refused most foreign aid, which only worsened the famine caused by their catastrophic agricultural policies. They were literally starving their own country to death in the name of ideological purity. The nightmare finally ended in late 1978 when Vietnam, after repeated border clashes, invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot and his followers fled to the jungles on the Thai border, where they waged a guerrilla war for years, supported at times by China and, shamefully, even tacitly by the United States due to Cold War politics. Pol Pot himself was never brought to international justice. He died in 1998 under house arrest by his own former comrades. His legacy is a nation still haunted by the ghosts of the nearly 2 million people who perished in his insane quest for a perfect society. Number 3. Mao Zedong, the great helmsman's deadly course. Taking the bronze medal in our race to the bottom of humanity is a man whose portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong, the founding father of the People's Republic of China. Now Mao is a complicated figure. He's revered by many in China for uniting the country and ending a century of humiliation, but here's the thing, he achieved that through policies that led to the deaths of more people than any other leader in human history. The sheer scale of the death toll under Mao is staggering, a number so large it becomes almost an abstraction. But it wasn't abstract for the tens of millions who perished. Mao's first great catastrophe was the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s. This was his lunatic plan to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into a communist industrial superpower, practically overnight. He ordered peasants to abandon farming to produce steel in primitive backyard furnaces. The result was useless pig iron, and more importantly, a complete collapse of the agricultural system. This led to the Great Chinese Famine, a man-made disaster of biblical proportions. An estimated 30 to 45 million people starved to death. It is by a massive margin the deadliest famine in human history. And all the while, the state denied it was even happening. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, Mao, feeling his power slipping, unleashed his next masterstroke, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, in 1966. This was a decade of pure, violent chaos. He mobilized the nation's youth into paramilitary groups called the Red Guards and told them to destroy the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. What that meant in practice was a nationwide witch hunt. Teachers were beaten to death by their students, ancient temples were destroyed, and anyone deemed a counter-revolutionary was publicly humiliated, tortured, or killed. The Cultural Revolution wasn't just about smashing the past, it was about destroying any potential rival to Mao's absolute power. It plunged the country into a civil war-like state. Millions were persecuted, and the death toll is estimated to be anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million. It destroyed a generation's education and left deep, lasting psychological scars on the entire nation. It was a movement driven by Mao's own paranoia and his cult of personality, which reached deific levels. His little red book became a sacred text, and loyalty to Chairman Mao was the only virtue that mattered. Mao ruled China until his death in 1976. Unlike many on this list, he died in power, celebrated as a national hero. His successors carefully curated his legacy, admitting he made mistakes but maintaining his status as the country's great founder. The staggering human cost of his rule, the famines, the purges, the political chaos, is often downplayed or censored outright within China, but the numbers don't lie. While he may have forged a new China, he did so on a mountain of corpses, making him responsible for more deaths than Hitler and Stalin combined. Number 2. Joseph Stalin, the Man of Steel's reign of terror. Our runner-up for the most dangerous dictator is a man whose nickname, Man of Steel, perfectly captures his cold, hard, and utterly inhuman nature, Joseph Stalin. After outmaneuvering his rivals following Lenin's death, Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into a totalitarian superpower built on a foundation of paranoia, slave labor, and mass murder. He was the ultimate puppet master, a gray blur in the background who methodically eliminated every single person who could possibly challenge him, until he alone held the fate of 170 million people in his hands. Stalin's rule was defined by a series of brutal campaigns to reshape Soviet society. His policy of forced collectivization in the early 1930s, aimed at seizing all private farmland for the state, was a declaration of war on the peasantry. It led to a horrific famine, particularly in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, where millions starved to death in what many historians now recognize as a deliberate act of genocide. He saw the independent farmers, or kulaks, as class enemies and set out to liquidate them as a class, which meant either starving them, executing them, or shipping them off to die in the gulag. And then, there was the Great Purge. In the late 1930s, Stalin's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He unleashed his secret police, the NKVD, on the country. No one was safe. He purged the Communist Party, the military leadership, the intelligentsia, and ordinary citizens. People were arrested in the dead of night based on fabricated confessions extracted through torture. Show trials were held for prominent Bolsheviks who would publicly confess to absurd crimes before being executed. It was a meat grinder that consumed millions, creating a society paralyzed by fear, where a careless word to a neighbor could mean a death sentence. The Gulag was the centerpiece of Stalin's terror state. This was a vast network of forced labor camps, stretching across the frozen tundra of Siberia. Millions of enemies of the people were sent there to work in mines, logging camps, and on construction projects under the most brutal conditions imaginable. It was slavery on an industrial scale. The death toll from exhaustion, starvation, and exposure in the Gulag system ran into the millions. It was a key part of the Soviet economy, a machine that ran on human suffering. Even his role in World War II, where he is often celebrated for defeating Hitler, is drenched in blood. His pre-war purge of the Red Army's officer corps left it disastrously unprepared for the Nazi invasion in 1941, and his military tactics were notoriously callous, using human wave attacks and issuing Order 227, not one step back, which meant that any soldier who retreated would be shot by blocking detachments. He sacrificed tens of millions of his own people to achieve victory. When he died in 1953, he left behind a global superpower, but one that was morally and spiritually broken, built on the bones of at least 20 million of its own citizens. Number 1. Adolf Hitler, the personification of evil. And here we are, at number 1. And frankly, was there ever any doubt? Topping our list of the most dangerous dictators in modern history is, of course, Adolf Hitler. There is no figure who more perfectly embodies the concept of political evil. He was a failed artist and bitter corporal who rose from obscurity to become the absolute ruler of Germany, and in the process, plunged the world into the most destructive war in its history and orchestrated the single most systematic and industrialized genocide ever conceived. He is the benchmark against which all other tyrants are measured. Hitler's rise to power was a masterclass in exploiting national grievance and democratic weakness. He preyed on Germany's humiliation after World War I, its economic desperation during the Great Depression, and deep-seated anti-Semitism. Through mesmerizing oratory and the thuggish violence of his brown shirts, he created a mass movement, the Nazi Party, that promised to restore German greatness. Once appointed chancellor in 1933, He moved with terrifying speed to dismantle the Weimar Republic, establishing a one-party state where he, as the Führer, held absolute, unquestionable power. Domestically, the Nazi regime was one of total control. All aspects of life were coordinated under Nazi ideology. The Gestapo, his secret state police, cultivated an atmosphere of terror, but the dark heart of his ideology was race. He believed in the supremacy of the Aryan race and the existential threat of the Jewish people. This obsession led to the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, and the state-sponsored violence of Kristallnacht in 1938. This was only the beginning of a descent into unimaginable horror. His ambition, however, was never limited to Germany. His goal was Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people, which meant the conquest and colonization of Eastern Europe. In 1939 he invaded Poland, triggering the start of World War II. For 6 years his war machine tore across Europe, North Africa, and the Soviet Union, resulting in the deaths of over 50 million people. The war was conducted with a level of brutality and racial ideology that was unprecedented, particularly on the Eastern Front, which was a war of annihilation. And that brings us to the Holocaust. The final solution to the Jewish question was the Nazi regime's systematic state-sponsored genocide of 6 million European Jews. Men, women, and children were rounded up, transported in cattle cars to a network of extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, and murdered in gas chambers on an industrial scale. Another 5 million people, Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, Slavs, and political opponents, were also systematically murdered. It is an event of such profound evil that it forever changed our understanding of what human beings are capable of. Hitler's legacy is not just one of war and tyranny, but of a crime so monstrous it stands as a permanent, absolute warning to all of humanity. He is, without question, the most dangerous dictator of modern times. Learning from the abyss. So there you have it. A veritable who's who of human awfulness. 10 men who, through ideology, paranoia, and an insatiable lust for power, inflicted almost unimaginable suffering on the world. Looking back at this list, from Gaddafi's chaotic vanity to Hitler's systematic evil, it's easy to feel a sense of despair. It's a highlight reel of humanity's worst impulses, a grim reminder of how fragile civilization can be, and how quickly the guardrails of democracy and human decency can be torn down by those who promise simple solutions and a strong hand. But despair isn't the point. The point is to remember. The point is to learn. Each of these regimes, in their own terrifying way, followed a pattern. They silenced the press, they demonized minorities, they created an US versus them narrative, they promised to restore a mythical past, and they demanded absolute loyalty. They convinced ordinary people to participate in, or at least look away from, extraordinary evil. Recognizing these warning signs isn't just an academic exercise, it's a fundamental civic duty for anyone who wants to live in a free and open society. Because history isn't just something that happened, it's a living lesson book. And the chapter on dictators is one we can never afford to skim. The ghosts of the millions who died under these regimes demand that we pay attention. They demand that we remain vigilant against the cult of the strong man, that we value critical thinking over blind faith, and that we defend the democratic institutions, however messy and imperfect they may be, that stand as the only real bulwark against the abyss. Forgetting is not an option, because the moment we do, we start paving the road for the next name on a list like this one. Thank you for watching.